it's another week gone by, which means it's time for a new episode of Zilog and Moto, the show where I go on a quest to play and review every English language release for the Master System, Genesis, or Mega Drive, depending on where you live, Sega CD, and 32X. In today's episode, we're taking a look at a home port of one of the arcade games that put Sega on the map in a big way in December of 1985, and that would be Space Harrier for the Master System. A few weeks ago, back in episode 57, I discussed the Master System version of Thunderblade, which was a conversion of the arcade machine. Why do I bring this up now? Well, other than the obvious that Space Harrier is also a Sega arcade conversion, both Space Harrier and Thunderblade ran on the same family of arcade hardware, i.e. Sega's Super Scalar series. Thunderblade, released in 1987, was designed to run on the brand new, at the time, Export hardware, which was the third in Sega's Super Scalar series of arcade boards. The Super Scalar series was designed specifically for arcade games that needed a bit of extra power and that weren't primarily in 2D, which were instead based around Sega's System series. However, starting the Super Scalar series off before Thunderblade and the X board was a board with no official name, but is usually referred to as either the Hang-On hardware or Space Harrier hardware, as technically Space Harrier utilizes a slightly upgraded version of this board, with faster clock 68000s, upgraded sound processors, more and faster RAM, and a better GPU. Actually, with all the changes between Hang-On and Space Harrier, I'm a little surprised they're considered the same board, but I guess perhaps they share a similar physical design and form factor. Essentially, in late 85, early 86, the hardware that ran Space Harrier was state-of-the-art for arcades. And to add in the insanity of the hardware base behind the game, along with a somewhat standard stand-up and sit-down versions of the game, there was also a deluxe version produced that featured a motorized seat that would move left and right depending on your screen movement. Sega would produce other deluxe arcade cabinets that would move over the next few years, most notably in Outrun and Power Drift, but it all started with Space Harrier. So, what is Space Harrier exactly? Well, it's kind of hard to describe, but its classification would be that of a rail shooter. You play as a character named Harrier and have to run/fly through 18 levels, destroying enemies and avoiding obstacles that come at you as you play in a third-person perspective. Why is your character named Harrier? Well, when the game was originally envisioned, you played as a fighter jet, in a game much more akin to Afterburner, but developer Yu Suzuki ended up altering the game design while keeping the name Harrier because, hey, it's a cool name. The game was so successful that it was licensed to developers and spawned many home versions on various 8 and 16-bit consoles and computers, and was even ported to the Famicom by Takara in 1989. The version being discussed today, the Master System version, appeared in the United States in early 1987, about a year after its arcade debut, and is notable for being the first 2 megabit cartridge produced for the console. So, how does the port hold up, having to replicate the most powerful arcade board in existence at the time? And is the game even that good to begin with? Well, we'll see about that, but first, a look at the physical package. Here is Space Harrier, and as you can immediately see, we've got a case of early Master System itis on the cover. I complain about these covers every single time one of these games gets reviewed, and today is no exception. The art here is mildly better than, say, Wonder Boy or Pro Wrestling, with at least a modicum of effort put into the drawing of the first boss on the cover, but yikes. I'll superimpose the Japanese cover here to the side, and I mean, come on. If you're a kid in 1987, or even now, do you want to play the game with the crappy North American European cover, or the Japanese cover? It's not even close. I'm honestly amazed the Master System did as well as it did when I see crap like this. As scummy as Nintendo was back then, Sega did themselves zero favors. Moving on from the cover art, this copy is actually in damn fine shape, minus one small chunk missing from the upper corner that I didn't even notice until doing this write-up. No scratches to the outer cover, no holes or rips anywhere, and an intact hang tab at the top. The inner cover is nearly mint as well, with no water or sun damage. This copy looks more or less like it did when it was originally for sale 33 years ago. One notable thing about the front cover and the spine is that Sega advertised in 3 separate places that this was a 2 megabit game rather than just 1, complete with the twice the mega power up in the corner. Now, granted, this was pretty standard design for Sega at the time, but you knew looking at it on the shelf that this game had extra oomph to it. On the back, you have the standard early Master System layout with 2 screenshots at the top, followed by some flavor text at the bottom about the game. The screenshots are pretty good quality for 1987. I've certainly seen a lot worse, although I think I would have chosen a different one for the one on the right, something with a different background color to be more eye-catching, perhaps. One thing I'll point out real quick that's mentioned in the flavor text is, for whatever reason, for the home release of Space Harrier, it doesn't take place in the Fantasy Zone. It now takes place in the Land of Dragons. This is kind of an odd distinction to me, and it doesn't really change the game at all, so I don't know why they did this. One of the noteworthy things about the arcade game is when you would start up the game, it says, "Welcome to the Fantasy Zone." So it just seems weird they would change gears like that. All I can figure is, since the actual Fantasy Zone games are wildly different, maybe they thought they would confuse kids if they referred to Fantasy Zone here as well, so they changed gears and, well, dragons are cool. Opening the box, and the cartridge is in good shape, and you'll see that this is another scenario like Thunderblade where I have multiple copies of the manual. However, I probably will keep both of these, because if you notice, while one manual is a single color blue manual, the other one is a 2-color black and blue manual, and it just looks better. My guess is that the black and blue version is from a later re-release. Both manuals are in decent shape, not perfect, but they both have lots of pictures in them about the various enemies and bosses in the game, and the other things you should avoid. Their solid manuals have the classic high score section at the end, and there's 2 very important features listed in here, the continue function and the sound test function, which without the manual a player wouldn't know about. Well, minus the internet anyway. Okay, so that's the physical package. Let's get into the game and see just how much of Yu Suzuki's vision they were able to cram onto the Master System. So, full disclosure, I don't think I've ever actually played Space Harrier in the arcades. I may have, but if I did, it was a very, very long time ago at a location that no longer exists. My first real experience with the game, or first one of any significance anyway, actually took place a few weeks ago, when I started playing the somewhat recent game, Yakuza 0. Yakuza 0 is set in late 80s Japan, and is very self-referential in regards to Sega, as there are Sega-branded arcades that can be visited in the game. As you progress through the game, 4 classic Sega arcade machines can be unlocked, consisting of Fantasy Zone, Super Hang-On, Outrun, and, you guessed it, Space Harrier. Of those titles, Space Harrier is actually the oldest of the bunch, although looking at Fantasy Zone you wouldn't be able to tell that. To those of you that haven't played it, Yakuza 0 is a gorgeous game, so imagine my surprise when I started playing Space Harrier within the game, and I was blown away at how great it looked. If anything, I should have been spoiled by Yakuza 0's graphics, but all of the Superscaler series games within still hold up, especially Space Harrier. The speed of the animation, the 3D effects, and most importantly, the detail and the colors of the sprites are all incredible, much less for a game released in the mid-80s. After playing the game, I totally get why the Superscaler boards were referred to as the most powerful arcade hardware at the time. Now, just like I had never played the arcade version of Space Harrier until very recently, I've never played a home version of it either. I own Space Harrier and Space Harrier 3D for the Master System, but I still don't have copies of Space Harrier for the 32X or Space Harrier 2 for the Genesis, the latter of which is surprisingly hard to find complete, I'm guessing because it's an older title. The series just hasn't been a focus of my collecting so far, and probably some of that is in relation to my unfamiliarity with the series. But after having my eyes opened, so to speak, by Yakuza 0, I had to go ahead and start getting these titles on the review schedule, and I figured what better way to start than with the original port on the Master System. Space Harrier, due to its popularity in the arcades, ended up being ported to a number of personal computers and consoles in the late 80s. And the Commodore 64 even had the odd situation of having two different ports of the game, one in Europe and one in everywhere else. But one of the earliest ports of the game, not surprisingly, is Sega's port on the Master System, released in March of 1987, a little over a year after the arcade version's release. As mentioned, even though this was a relatively early release for the Master System, coming out only 7 months after the release of the console, it does at least have the technical achievement of being the first 2 megabit game on the console, and to even attempt to recreate the arcade version faithfully, it was going to need all of those 2 megabits. Part of the reason for this is due to the Master System's inability to do sprite scaling. Unlike the arcade version, which could use the same sprite and enlarge or shrink it on command as necessary to give the feel of coming towards or going away from the player, the Master System instead has to cheat to try to represent itself in the same manner. Instead, the game constantly swaps and moves around larger and smaller sprites to give the illusion of moving closer or further away. And it works. Sort of. Unfortunately, this workaround approach to the visuals in the game causes a few problems. The first and most obvious problem that you will see pretty early on is that the sprites are drawn in boxes. When there's nothing behind the sprites, you won't notice this, as the box around the sprite will blend in with the background. However, when they either come in front of the checkerboard floor or in front of other sprites, it tends to look pretty ugly. Thunderblade, that I looked at back in episode 57, has the same problem with some of the side scenery, especially the vegetation in level 3, and it makes sense that they would use a similar programming tack since both of these games were originally superscalar games. However, while it just looks ugly in Thunderblade, in Space Harrier, because it affects the actual in-game action, it causes serious problems when trying to determine where things are and where you should aim at or maneuver based on that. Another issue with the graphics as they're presented is just that the frame rate doesn't appear to be constant. It might actually be, and it's just an illusion, but there are definitely times when fireballs are shot toward your character, and depending on what's going on screen, they'll seem to speed up, which can be a disaster when you're used to the game action moving at a certain rate. And then on the flip side, sometimes frames of animation appear to drop, for lack of a better description, and then all of a sudden you have an enemy or a tower appear to teleport right into you, resulting in a nice insta-kill. However, the graphics aren't all bad. The game designers probably could have gotten better performance out of the game if they'd gone the route Takara went with their Famicom version, and basically recreated the game from the ground up, using smaller and much less detailed sprites. And to Takara's credit, the Famicom version looks like it does play better, with smooth action all around. But at the same time, it only has a vague resemblance to the arcade game. The Master System version, on the other hand, at least looks like they tried to be accurate to the original game. While there's no way the sprites can look exactly like they do in the arcade, they are extremely colorful, which to me was one of the hallmarks of the arcade machine. And all the sprites are pretty detailed. For example, there's an enemy called the Looper in level 3 that loops at you in a kamikaze attack, and I was really impressed with how close they got it to how it originally looked, especially when it gets right on top of you, which will happen more often than not. From an audio perspective, Sega did a really good job on both the background music and the sound effects. The music is pretty solid and fits the game well. There's a few different tracks in the game as well, so you don't have to worry too much about getting annoyed by hearing the same songs over and over, as you'll probably get annoyed by cheap kills long before that. More on that in a minute. There's not many sound effects in the game, but the ones there are of good quality. The voice sound effect for Welcome to the Fantasy Zone was removed at the beginning of the game, but there's still Get Ready for when you restart play after death, one of the signatures of the arcade machine. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one thing that I really like about the game, and that's the fact it's the earliest game I'm familiar with that has a sound test screen, and each of the sounds are detailed. You're not just playing sound effect 23. I'm sure Space Harrier isn't the first game to have this function, but it just makes it feel more advanced than 1987, as that's something I associate more with Genesis titles. And as a bonus, there's a hidden options screen as well that you access via the sound test that allows you to change the game's difficulty, switch to inverted controls, or change your character into a plane, in a nod to the game's original design. There's a lot of effort here that lesser games don't exhibit, and it's nice to see. Where I feel let down by the game most of all is in the gameplay. The game controls fine, more or less. Harrier moves as you would expect him, and as was the custom back in the day, rapid fire isn't enabled by default. So to really play the game and get the most joy, you'll need to play it with a gamepad that supports rapid fire. But not just any controller, as I found out. I usually play these games with an 8-bit DOE M30 wireless controller. However, when playing the game with that controller, rapid fire didn't appear to work. I switched to a version of the Genesis 6 button pad put out by Majesco, which had rapid fire functionality, and that worked great. I also tested the 6-button arcade stick, and it worked as well, but only with the rapid fire dial turned down to minimum. So it seems the issue with the wireless controller is that rapid fire is too rapid for the Master System to handle. Just throwing that out there in case any of you try it. The major issue with the gameplay is simply due to the way the game animates, with the way that enemy sprites and towers can just pop in. You end up with a lot of cheap deaths that probably wouldn't have occurred otherwise. The arcade version is a good mix of attack and avoid, with you attempting to blow up all the enemies you can, along with some destructible background elements, but then also having to avoid shots from enemies, or avoiding invincible enemies and towers in the play area. Unfortunately, due to the increased difficulty in hitting enemies, even with a rapid fire controller because of the way the game is animated, you're much better off primarily avoiding all enemies as well, unless they're ones that actively shoot at you. There's just too great a risk of shooting at an enemy, not hitting it, and a second later it smashes straight into you, taking you out. While you can certainly adjust your gameplay to accommodate for this, it just reinforces that this is not the arcade machine, and it's unfortunately not the same experience. All in all, while I appreciate what Sega tried to do here, Space Harrier on the Master System misses the mark a bit, and due to that, I'm only awarding it 2 stars. While I feel it was a much better effort than something like Thunderblade, especially since it came out on the system so much earlier, I can't really recommend playing this unless you just really love shooters and the Master System. In which case, by all means, give it a try. But don't be surprised if you find yourself running out of lives and continues far before the 18th level. Okay, that was Space Harrier for the Master System. And while it didn't quite hit the mark, it at least was a very solid effort at an early point in the Master System's lifespan. And even with all the issues it has, it's like 1,000 times better than Rise of the Robots was last week. I at least had fun at times with Space Harrier, and made it a good portion of the way through the game with limited playtime this week. Tune in next week when I change things up a little bit and review a game that is not in my list of 1,200 or so 8 and 16-bit games for the Sega platforms. And unlike something like Xenocrisis, isn't even designed for the Genesis. Why am I doing this review when I have so many others on the list still to do? Well, don't expect this to be a common occurrence, but a game was released last week that's part of a series that is absolutely vital to the Genesis/Mega Drive, and because of that, I've just got to cover it. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.